Good morning, everyone. How's my volume? Good? So this work is primarily Diyi Yang's, but unfortunately she isn't able to be here because of visa problems, so I'm going to do my best to do her work justice. Prior research on self-disclosure offline and on general social networking sites has shown that people reveal more in private communication channels than public ones on average, but it isn't clear if these rules also apply in communities where people often disclose highly intimate details about their lives to seek social support or to provide it to others. Our work here looks at how members of a large online cancer support community decide where and how much to disclose, and how much they strategically use different communication channels to balance benefits and risks brought by their disclosure. Online health support groups like Cancer Care and the Cancer Support Community are places where patients and caregivers gather to share experiences, ask questions, or provide information, emotional support, and advice. Based on recent statistics, over 28% of internet users actually use online support groups. In online health communities in general, people need to reveal personal information to others to seek social support, share their experiences with others, and form social ties. For instance, people describe their personal experiences in detail in order to get help from others. To provide support, people may also need to disclose their status in order to provide context in seeking support. And similarly, they share personal experiences to provide social comparison. Prior research shows that channel shapes what people will share. On average, people share more intensely and share more negative thoughts about themselves in private messages compared to public status posts, though there are some exceptions. However, it's not yet clear whether these findings generalize to online health support groups where sensitive disclosures are the norm. In this work, we investigate how members of one large online cancer support community decide where and how much to disclose, and how they strategically use different communication channels to balance benefits and risks brought by their self-disclosure. Our recent research questions are, first, how do members self-disclose in the private and public channels of an online cancer group? And second, how do users' self-disclosures in the different channels affect responders' self-disclosure and support provision in return? Our research is conducted on the Cancer Support Network, which is the largest online health support group in the United States. We collaborated with the American Cancer Society and were given permission to get access to all public posts and comments, along with profile information for users registered between 2002 and 2015. This allowed us to use about 1 million messages, and that came from 48,000 users for our analyses. I'm going to refer to 2 communication channels here primarily. When I mention public channels, I'm talking about the Cancer Support Network discussion boards. And when I talk about private channels, I'm referring to the Cancer Support Network email, which is basically a private chat function. Specifically, in this work, we look at negative self-disclosure, which refers to expression of negative thoughts, feelings, or emotions, but note this doesn't mean bad self-disclosure, but rather self-disclosure about negative things. We obtained human annotated data from existing work and followed their procedures and the linguistic features that they found most important. We trained machine learning models to approximate human judgments of the amount of negative self-disclosure in each message, and these machine learning models were highly correlated with the human judgments, so we applied the models to estimate the negative self-disclosure contained in the full data set. I'm going to comment briefly on the risks and rewards for disclosure in these settings. So in contrast to traditional social networks, most or all users have cancer or have friends or family members with cancer. And because of this, self-disclosure is key for seeking support and carries fewer risks than in traditional networks. This effect is further compounded by a lack of concern about self-presentation because the users are all pseudonymous in private messaging. So therefore, we expect 2 hypotheses. First, people self-disclose more when eliciting support than providing it. And second, when replying to others' messages, people will self-disclose more in a private channel, the direct messages, compared to a public one, which here is the pseudonymous forums. In this figure, we show that the average negative self-disclosure per message in thread starting messages, which are the first messages in threads where people typically ask questions or seek support, had higher levels of negative self-disclosure than their replies, which confirms H1 that people negatively self-disclose more to elicit support than to provide it in return. This next figure compares self-disclosure in the private and public channels when people were responding to others' messages. Results are inconsistent with the second hypothesis. Even when providing support to others, people express more negative self-disclosure in the public channel than in the private one. We further validated this via content analysis by examining the use of terms from LIWC in the public and private settings. People were more likely to use words referring to negative emotions and sadness, but interestingly not anger in public. These differences in language use provide explanations for H1 and also present a micro-level picture of content differences in both the public and private channels. So now we've answered the first question, and next we're going to look at what are the outcomes of their self-disclosure. One of the possible outcomes here is responder self-disclosure, which means how much people self-disclose in response to others' disclosures. Reciprocity of self-disclosure is especially important in health support groups. When people seek support by revealing their personal experiences and emotions, responders' follow-up self-disclosure can benefit support seekers in that they're being understood and they feel like others care about them. And it can also show that others have experiences like theirs. As we saw in the first part of the investigation, self-disclosure is different between public and private channels. Although the personal stories that support seekers receive may be equally valuable regardless of the channel through which it's received, the cost to the provider of revealing this personal information may be less when they deliver it over a private channel. Therefore, we expect that self-disclosure will be reciprocated more in the private channel than the public channel. To investigate whether one person's self-disclosure encourages others to self-disclose in response and how the channel, public or private, affects the reciprocity of self-disclosure, we built several random effect linear regression models to predict the amount of negative self-disclosure contained in responders' messages, using as predictors the amount of prior self-disclosure in senders' messages, whether the channel was public or private, as well as responders' gender and the historical levels of self-disclosure. The control variables, as you can see here, show that women and people who self-disclosed in the past do more in a current message exchange. And also there's a clear reciprocity effect. People self-disclose more when responding to messages that themselves include more self-disclosure. However, the interaction shows that reciprocity effect depends significantly on the channel of communication. So here we plot this interaction effect. You can see that the reciprocity of negative self-disclosure only occurs in the private channel. The red line, you can see the color. The red line shows people self-disclose more in response to other self-disclosure in the private channels, the direct messages. But the black line shows that this reciprocity doesn't occur at all in the public channel. Although support providers could respond to seekers either in public or private, using the public channel can give extra benefits, both to the provider and to other members of the community. First, if providers respond to a particular seeker in a public channel, their response could potentially help a larger audience of lurkers, members in similar situations, or even non-members who come across the responses via internet search. Also, in addition to helping others, support providers may be concerned with the way that others perceive them, so this might motivate them to manage their behavior strategically in order to present a positive image to others. And by responding publicly, they can earn a reputation with a larger audience as helpful, knowledgeable, or supportive. Therefore, our fourth hypotheses are that people will provide more support in response to negative self-disclosure, and this effect will be stronger in public channels. This is past just amount of reciprocity, but rather more support. We again built regression models to test the extent to which support seekers' negative self-disclosures predicted responders' provision of support in return, both informational and emotional, and whether these effects varied with the privacy of the communication channel, again, public or private. Social support labels are obtained from the earlier work. Sender's negative self-disclosure led to more informational support. Model 2 adds the interaction again between channel and sender's self-disclosure, and sender's negative self-disclosure positively predicted receiving informational support in both channels, but the effect was an order of magnitude larger, again, in the private channel than the public one. These interactions are illustrated in this figure, which disconfirm H4. People received more informational support when they negatively self-disclosed in their initial message, but this effect is much stronger in the private channel, again, than the public one. There was a similar interaction when looking at the receipt of emotional support. People received more emotional support in response to messages that contained more negative self-disclosure, but this effect was much stronger in the private channel than the public one. So, to sum up, people express more self-disclosure when seeking support. When replying to others who have disclosed, people express more negative self-disclosure, specifically in public channels. Reciprocity occurred for negative self-disclosure, but the reciprocity effect was much stronger in the private channel, and in fact not at all in the public channel. And finally, sender's negative self-disclosure was associated with receiving more social support, with effects much stronger in the private channel. There are a few design implications that we draw from this work. The hosters of these types of support groups could introduce interface features to encourage people to self-disclose in more appropriate channels depending on the nature of support they're looking for. And tutorials could show members how to do that effectively and could help them consider potential risks. And also, platforms could detect users who are about to share vulnerable content and pair them with more experienced users who could pay better attention to their requests. Thank you very much. I'll do my best to answer your questions.
If you have a question, you can approach a floor mic or signal me.
Hi, I'm Lucia from the University of Edinburgh. So thank you for your amazing presentation. I would like to ask a question. You have provided statistics and data for the interactions between the responders and the posters. Mm-hmm. Have you guys also looked at who are these responders and what are their characteristics?
Yes, in some senses. So we did not individually analyze the private messages for protection of the participants and confidentiality, but further work in this line, again led by Diyi, looked at the different roles of the support providers. So she classified them over time depending on whether they were newer users versus more advanced users and what their main interaction styles were. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Hi, really nice talk. Mark Schlager from Google. I'm wondering if you could speculate on whether you think there are implications from this work for close-knit networks, family and friend networks of people going through illness or other sorts of health-related issues. Whether you would think that perhaps the people should communicate one-on-one certain issues, or whether they should broadcast others to all family and friends?
That's a good question. I think one of the main differences, obviously, is the pseudonymous nature of these forums versus, I would assume, the identified nature probably of family and friend communications. That's all right. Yeah. I think there probably are comparisons to be made. There's been a lot of other interesting work on self-disclosure to family and friends on places like Facebook for sensitive personal events. And I think I would probably look toward that work to supplement this in terms of suggestions for private versus public disclosure.
More questions?
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our speaker.